and welcome back to the Sports Structured podcast. We're aiming to do things a bit differently by providing an independent voice amidst all the noise to give you the inside track on what makes the business of elite sport tick. But it's not just chat for chat's sake. We're backed up by Leonard Curtis's cutting-edge research, which provides validated sets of financial data plus professional commentary for major sports, all in one place. Boiling things down, it's all the facts and figures you need to know from the people who know what they're talking about, and backed by Leonard Curtis, who've more than 30 years of expertise in recovery and turning businesses around. Leonard Curtis were the first ever company to profile Rugby Union in this country with their 2004 report. And with the 2026 analysis now being gathered, it's the perfect time to examine the health of the 15-man code on these shores. Alongside me here in the impressive UCFB broadcast studios in the heart of Media City are a hooker, a winger and an academic. Let me introduce you to a man who was born in Middlesex but sees himself as a Welshman, was raised in Wales and even went for the Welsh head coach and CEO roles before embarking on a global rugby journey that took him to Australia and Fiji. He is Mr. Mark Evans. Our second guest is one of the Sports Structured team and the man responsible for the Leonard Curtis Business of Sport series. He played club rugby in Wales but pulled on an England jersey. Lovely to see Alex Cadwallader with us again. And finally, another regular and another reason why we do things differently. He's not just a netball dad, he's the Dean of UCFB and a leading sports business academic. Professor Rob Wilson is the man who really brings the analysis to life. We were hoping to make it a fantastic four and invited Prem Rugby CEO Simon Massey-Taylor to join us, but sadly we didn't receive a response. Not to worry though, we've got a pretty strong front line, so time to get our gum shields on and hit the tackling bags by looking at the state of rugby union in this country. This is the Sports Structured podcast with Leonard Curtis. Mark, welcome. Alex, Rob, lovely to see you again. Regulars, OGs. Mark, this is very, very different. I'm going to hit you with a curveball to start off with. How do we make rugby union sustainable in this country? I mean, that's the $64,000 question, isn't it?
Depends how you define sustainable. And I'm not trying to be, sort of evasive here, but there's lots of sports. Because it means it's got to be operationally profitable. There's loads of sports around the world that aren't operationally profitable and are yet still seen to be successful and grow. I mean, it always amuses me when people go on about French club rugby just keeping the same sport. It says French, it's brilliant, and it's so big, and it's so the TV deals are so much bigger. It's all true, but they're nearly all heavily loss making, and they're nearly all reliant on patrons, or if you want to use a less patronising word, investors. So I think it really does depend how you want to measure it, which is why it's really useful that when you get you look at the data and you think, well, it's looking a bit better than it was if you're just talking about England, which I think we are. I'm happy to talk about Wales for a bit, but
we can do that in a minute. Yeah. Reports all about
look at England, and yes, all the clubs are still losing money on their P&L, and it doesn't seem to be reducing significantly. The balance sheets are a little bit better, but not much. And so I totally understand when people look at it and say, well, that just looks sort of insolvent to a degree.
It's a word that's used in the report quite a lot.
But it depends. I think there are some interesting developments since last year. Obviously, people talk about the Red Bull and the Black Knights into Exeter, and minority shareholder into Northampton, and even James Dyson, after many, many, many years of being the sponsor, is now the shareholder. Well, if there's no value in the clubs, then those four have got it wrong, haven't they? Now, they may be
But there's plenty of people who've got it wrong leading up. I mean, taking you back to 95, when the whole sport went professional, did you think in 30 years' time would be in pretty much a similar position than you were maybe 30 years ago?
No, I didn't think the last 3 years. Seriously, I didn't think at the beginning we'd get anywhere near as far as we've got. And again, I know that's a slightly counterintuitive view, but it was such a small sport. I mean, it went from what we've never really been able to do, if you want to do this, is we've never aligned the key components that we've always tended to go, well, we're going to spend this much on players, or we're going to spend this much on coaches. It's not just players, or this amount on executives. And then we'll work out how we're going to pay for it. And that's how it started, which you could sort of forgive, because there wasn't really any revenue, and you sort of, well, we've got to start somewhere. And John Hall and people like that came in, and off we went. And nobody quite knew where it was going. And I would argue that it's going into a new phase, and maybe that's me being eternally optimistic, but I don't think so. I think there's these guys will know better than me, but there's a lot happening in sports clubs as assets in the world at the moment. And I don't think it's a coincidence that suddenly you've got 3 or 4 pretty well funded individual stroke corporate entities of various types looking at the sport and going, that's a bit undervalued. Or perhaps other sports are overvalued, and that looks as if it might be worth a shot. Well, if you look back and think, well, when Worcester and Irish and Jersey, the one everyone always forgets, and the one I've just forgotten, Wasps, they were desperate for a new investment, and nothing at that time, it wasn't that long ago, transpired. So I think it's being unduly pessimistic to say, well, nothing's changed. But at one and the same time, you've got to say it's probably, there's a lot still to do. Let's put it that way.
Which, Rob, then begs the question, I think, what's in it for these people who are investing? Because, we saw the CVC investment of 200 million, that's been chewed and gone away. They haven't got a return, they're still waiting, those people.
They are. I was really interested to hear Mark's academic answer to your first question. How do we define sustainability? And when you look at any sport, any professional team sport, you've got all those verticals. It might be, do we have a sustainable community programme? Do we have a sustainable revenue profile? Do we have a sustainable balance sheet and P&L? Do we have a sustainable season ticket list? Do we have a sustainable stadium? Are we environmentally sustainable? And all of those things that we can look at, most of which costs money in terms of investment, and we're always trying to balance what are we bringing in versus what are we spending. We've got an interesting situation, haven't we, in rugby, where we have a salary cap that is relatively fixed, but doesn't really match the revenue profile of the teams that are playing and participating within the division, which when you then talk about Wasps and you talk about Jersey and you talk about London Irish and you talk about Worcester, that was the functional problem, wasn't it? The salary cap was set too high for them to be able to be sustainable in spending against it and bringing in all their other revenues. And I think that's at the heart of certainly the work that we're doing through the Leonard Curtis Business Support Report, is where are the problems in professional rugby union, and how might we look to resolve some of those issues? And I think the last 12 months with rugby union has been really interesting, because my view is we're starting to see more fiscally responsible decisions being made at a number of clubs. Now, that might be, and I don't know this personally because we don't speak to all of the CEOs and the investors, but I look at it and I think to myself, are you gearing up for investment? Are you looking at trimming your wage a little bit, not spending up to salary cap to make yourself more attractive? And then you have the James Dysons of this world, the CVCs or whoever else it might be that are looking at the investment, that are genuinely looking at rugby union and thinking, not necessarily is that better value, but it's a damn sight cheaper than trying to acquire a championship or a League One football club or another professional team sport and a franchise. Yet you've got a sport that has an incredible amount of support in pockets of society where you can deliver, I think, really successful business models. So some of those investors might not have got their money back yet, but I just sense that rugby union is professionalising itself in a sustainability fashion that will make it more attractive.
Sustainability might be a dirty word then. I got Mark's back up a little bit, Alex, but is it a question of sometimes looking at sport through a business prism?
Yeah, I think so, but that brings its challenges. one quite interesting comparison is, Mark mentions Sir John Hall. When he came in, first thing he did was paid £1 million for England Twiggy-Marler.
Yeah, signed you as well.
Well, no, that was a long time ago after that. Actually, different ownership by that point.
David Thompson, right?
Indeed, exactly. But quite interestingly, if you go and ask most of the public who have the Red Bulls signed since they've taken over, and you hear, lots of other sort of podcasts, we'd love to hear the Red Bulls going out and getting DuPont or Henry Pollock and making this big splash, was actually looking at it from a business model, and they've been quite sensible with some of their recruitment. They haven't chased anything. They don't appear to have overpaid.
Yep.
They've even signed a chap from, and Mark will know better, from down in New Zealand, that I think the New Zealand RFU want to get him out of his contracts. He's performed very well. So
Good spot then.
So it's a
Really good player ID.
Yeah. So it's a different approach as opposed to, let's go and buy some superstars and let's hope that then attracts all our crowds. It's actually been a bit more responsible. And then the next question is, it's almost where do you want to get to with a sustainable sport? Because, we can look at other ones and see what's happened. If you look at Crystal Palace in football, the ownership changed in, I think, August, too late to avoid being fined and losing their place in the Europa League. But by all accounts, they're now looking to sell. They've engaged a US consulting business to sell the club, having had probably their best ever season. So it's a commodity. So do we want our clubs just to be commodities that are traded? So it's always that ongoing decision. What do you want? You have a very profitable, sustainable business, but then that means people just see you as a commodity. And that's the difficult balance to always strike.
To make you feel better about being in this room, having put your back up, you're the sort of person that people ring who are the big hitters who say, is this worth making the hit? So you get a phone call from somebody who looks to invest in the club. Would you say Rugby Union is the place to go at the moment with the Millans?
It depends on what again, I'm saying depends a lot, but I think that is the answer. It depends on what they're looking for it to do. So if you're looking to put it into a multi-sport investment fund, let's say, okay, of which there are many, that sort of is a diversification, you're spreading your risk, that makes a fair bit of sense. I mean, I think the bit that I think is missing, which allows us to analyse this better, is we don't know how much Black Knight paid for Exeter.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we don't know really how much. I think we do know how much the guy at Northampton put in and for what. So I think that allows you to give a valuation more or less on Northampton.
I mean, 45 million has been bandied around for
has it?
Yeah.
I haven't heard that one. I mean, I looked at the valuation for Northampton. I thought that's cheap. I really did. I mean, I looked at that and thought, if that's true, and you've always got a caveat there, if that is true, for whatever it was, 15% or something, I thought that only values Northampton at that much. There's a property element in that. That looks cheap to me. And I mean, people say you can't make money in buying and selling professional sports teams. I mean, that simply isn't true. There are many people around the world who've made a lot of money buying and selling sports teams who were not necessarily profitable. Now, who's to say Rugby Union may not become one of those? I'm not saying it's certain by any means, but I think the jury's out a bit more than it was maybe 3 years ago. And I often think back, the investment that came in from CVC, if COVID had not, it's a would have, could have, should have, isn't it? But if COVID had not happened, what would have happened to that investment? Because where it went, to be honest, it either went to clubs who were heavily indebted and they used it to pay down debt, or clubs used it to get through 2 years when their revenue fell off a cliff.
Yeah.
And
so the timing in some ways was perfect, certainly for the clubs.
Well, you might argue even more would have fallen off the cliff. Again, you just don't know. It's like we don't know the answer. We don't know whether the owners at the time would have put in more capital or whether it was just, you know what, that's just a bridge too far. You just don't know.
But as the man with the figures, I mean, £340 million worth of collective debt.
Yeah,
it's a big figure.
It was trending down. You know, the reality was, and I think we said it at the time, you know, when Worcester went, when when Wasps went, when London Irish went. There was an inevitability with that as a consequence of the financial management that was happening at those clubs, the relative success they hadn't achieved on the field, and also the outcome of COVID and the gap between what they needed and what they had. And I do think it's fair to say that had the remnants of that CVC cash not been kicking around, we would have been talking about more clubs. But the converse would also be true. I think that money, the investment from CVC, would have boosted the game in a way that it was intended to do, net of COVID, and we'd probably been talking about clubs that weren't balance sheet insolvent, or at least more clubs that weren't balance sheet insolvent. We'd have started to see a much sharper trend upwards on attendances, which is where that valuation, I think, comes in. When you look at those organisations now, when Alex and I talk about it, we often say, well, there's some green shoots of recovery here and there. And of course, we're looking at past data. We don't have the actual information today on what those clubs are doing, but it feels like it's trending upwards. Better financial decisions. Some of those bigger, more established clubs are getting more fans through the gate, and they've now got that balance between their off-field financial performance and their on-field sporting performance. I've said it before, I'm a big Gloucester Rugby fan. They look like they are more sustainable, in inverted commas, off the field on their balance sheet and on their P&L. But my goodness me, they were pretty awful last year on the field.
What's behind their raising money through fans?
To an extent, I mean, look, the commercial director, James Forrester's doing a really good job at and not just single-year deals, but multi-year deals where they're getting buy-in from those sponsors. But a lot of those are kind of local-ish, which is typified in rugby, I think, more generally. Hence, it's so difficult for them to compete against some of the other sports where you're bringing in national or international sponsors. A lot of our rugby teams are sponsored by local-ish organisations, which naturally have less cash to be able to do it. Gloucester, like Northampton, like Leicester, like Bath, have always been historically well supported. But there's only so much you can squeeze your supporters on. And, you know, what it seems to me from the outside looking in at Gloucester is they're trying to cut their cloth accordingly, but that's having a direct impact now on their sporting performance, and they're kind of at the wrong end of the Prem for me as a fan, which probably means I'm less likely to try and go every Saturday afternoon because it's a bit of a trek from Sheffield.
It's interesting though. There are 10 teams in the Premiership now. I think there's three things linked. They're all linked in the same area that happened in the last year. So 5 of them aren't spending to the cap.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's new.
Yeah.
Okay. And a team that isn't spending to the cap has just won the Premiership.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's almost unheard of. And the team that is got the highest revenue of the league is 9th. I say that, but that's my team. So I find that very awkward. It's a team I support. So that's interesting. So, however, here's the negative side of it. I still say that the level of spend on, let's say, the football department, not just players, on the football department, that's the real indicator. Not everything goes on like the salary cap, but it isn't the cap, because actually, on average, if you look at the report on the about the average spend on players, including academy and all the rest of it, is about 7 million this year. It's about 7 million.
Yep.
Now, you look at the amount of central revenue that comes in from broadcast, which is about 40, and then you have to almost count the RFU's contribution to academies as almost like a sort of annuity payment. That's 33. So you've got nearly £75 million coming in, regardless almost of what the club does. That's almost like you sort of, and that's how most sports have tended to be organised, but it's dominated by broadcast. For 10 teams. Right, so we can all do the maths, right? So you then look at the other league I've worked in most for longest, the NRL, Rugby League in Australia, have just brought their broadcast deal out. £350 million, not dollars, 700 million Australian dollars. £350 million plays 40, but put the 33 on, plays 70. 70 over in the Premiership, 350 in. Now they've got more teams. They're going to go to 20. There's no question they're going to go to 20. They're at 17 at the moment. Yeah. They're going to go to 20. 350, and their salary cap at the moment is lower than the Premiership.
We said that on the panel, didn't we, at the launch of the first?
You know,
Yeah.
it's going to go, all the chitter chat, and NRL is so well covered in you get information so quickly. So everyone seems to be feeling that the salary cap's going to go to 17 over the course of the next CBA. And the clubs are looking for 25 apiece. So they'll have a 7 million Aussie dollar margin.
Mm-hmm.
Well, all I'm saying is look at the alignment. You know, there's a sport that generates £350 and their salary cap is round about the same as the Premiership. There's a significant misalignment still. The other thing, sorry to go on to the last point, the thing that does worry me, so that worries me. The other thing that worries me is, I think, and you're probably much better qualified to speak on this than I am, but the broadcast market in Europe looks flat to me.
Mm. It is.
It looks maybe 3-4%. If in real terms, just above the rate of inflation, maybe a couple of percentage over the inflation rate. So in real terms, and you look at every other. Well, look at the one I've just used. Look at Australia. Why are their broadcast revenue? Well, it's a great sport, very good, massive coverage in 2 states, market of 13 million people, but there's competitive tension in their broadcast market, massive. I just don't see the broadcast revenues, not going to do with rugby, but I don't see broadcast revenues in the UK exploding.
No.
So where's the big step change coming from? That's my question.
And I think most sports have that quick question, don't they? They're all trying to do that. We're all trying to find a new drive to survive, to suddenly unlock this audience. And it's a challenge for all of them. Probably the question I've got for you, Mark, is what allows the NRL to manage themselves in that way to achieve that? Is the governance a lot stronger as opposed to over here?
Single word answer?
Yeah.
Governance. And I do think there are some, we have hardly touched on, I'm amazed we haven't gotten this early, but the whole closing of the league is a really interesting development.
Yeah.
I've said this for 30 years now. Until you effectively closed the league, I found it really difficult to see how you got a load of the governance changes through that it really does require. I use the word alignment a lot, but if you're going to align all the different interests, the players, the clubs, the league, the union in our case, because we have that international layer as well, which adds a level of complexity, you've got to get your governance right. And I don't think we have, but closing off and making it into an expansion league, and I'm sure we'll come back to talk about that, is a really good, and they've done some, I think Simon, who has done some really good things, quite small things. He's brought in a salary cap collar. So you get rid of free riders. So you can't spend, I think it's less than 90%. I've been arguing that for years. And they weren't having it.
Yeah.
So, because if you're going to close the league, albeit you should genuinely want to expand it over time, you can't have a free rider. You can't have Red Bull spending 3 million when everybody else is spending at least 5.5. The fans hate it. It takes away all kinds of jeopardy and uncertainty of outcome. And closed leagues need every single team to be in with a chance of winning it.
So franchise rugby or expansion league, call it what you like, is that then a no-brainer, bearing in mind that this country is almost born on relegation and promotion? You're talking about the benefits of something being closed.
No, football is born. Six Nations never had it. This has always staggered me, right? The antipathy shown by much of the rugby media and many rugby followers, and yet the most successful rugby product by a country mile is a closed league.
That's a good point. That's envy of the world as well.
Yeah. So I've always believed in closed leagues that can expand. Okay? I'll give one and I'll shut up, but I'll promise. In 1997, 2 leagues started, one on this side of the Atlantic, the Premiership, the Prem, I hate that, by the way, and on the other side, MLS. and they both started with 12 teams. And one had promotion and relegation, and the other was a closed expansion league. Flip it forward 30 years, one has 10, and the other has 32. I don't think that's a coincidence.
And not only that, the franchises are growing and growing.
Yes.
And every time you add a new one, you just put a X2, X3, X4. What was the last one? $500 million?
I saw an article this week saying that the 3 Canadian franchise should get out, should sell and get out.
Yeah.
They'll make a fortune, and they've got. I've never worked how they work there. They're paying 53% income tax on the salary cap. In some of their states, they're paying nothing. I've never worked out how they do that, but there we are. I haven't studied it for long.
Has it been crying out for this for a long time then?
Yeah, I think for 30 years, but that's just me.
No, but I mean, you were doing things at Harlequins that astonished people back in the day without blowing smoke.
Wouldn't go that far, but
you expanded the stadium. You had more people watching.
Yeah.
You were more successful than your predecessors.
Well, we did some good things. We did some terrible things too. But it's light and shade, isn't it? Look, I've always been in favour of a closed league with managed expansion, and it's taken us 30 years to get there. I think it's a big step. It's one of my favourite phrases. It's a necessary but not sufficient step.
So where's it go? How do you run it successfully in this country? Bearing in mind we're maybe the whole franchise system is alien to us in some ways. We're learning.
No,
or
it's
does
not alien to cricket, is it?
No,
We've
maybe
had
not.
18 counties since the day dot. What? Yeah.
So is the term franchise the thing that's the problem?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a language thing.
Yeah, and I think people often compare it to
our national game.
Yeah, national game. They compare it, but then they also compare it to the NFL, and suddenly think as soon as we do that, that's box ticked. Suddenly you're going to have people like the Jones family that became multi-billionaires just from owning the Dallas Cowboys. They weren't major oil tycoons first. It's actually they timed it very well. Jerry Jones obviously commercially astute, but they've made their wealth from that. So we're not suddenly going to be like the NFL. But from my point of view, as I think I've always said, we've got a product that broadly turns over £200 million a year. Why don't we just for once not spend 230? Why don't we just spend 180 and make a bit of profit and then build from there? And then there's still the dream that obviously you've got your club in Gloucester, but if someone is passionate about Canterbury and wants a club there, to put together a sensible business proposal, put their backing behind it, gets assessed, and then that can be added in due course. In the interim, you've got a product that is not hemorrhaging cash. You're not reliant on benefactors or sponsors putting money in. And ideally, the governance improves because they can see the benefits all working together without the risk of actually, I'm going to get relegated and I therefore don't want to, give away my trade secrets to one of my competitors.
Does that money saving though hit the players? Because I know no former player that talks about having less money rather than more.
I would say, having spoken to players and been at clubs where you're paid late, I'd rather have the comfort that my club's going to make it through the season, the whole league is stable, than suddenly turning up on a Tuesday and meeting someone like me who tells them very quickly that unfortunately they're not getting paid at the end of the month. So I think for them it's a longer term play. But obviously, players want to get paid as much as they can as they go forward. I think the real challenge is if, and I'll be interested to get Mark's view, is how many other sports do we not allow our elite sportsmen not to maximise their earning capacity? So,
well, football did till 1963.
Okay, I don't remember.
Well, I was 4. It was a big story. In my nursery, it was a big story. Look, the argument you made is the long run. My argument is always about alignment. Okay, if you have to align the interests of all the different horrible words, stakeholders, right? You have to align the interests. The players are a big stakeholder. You have to also align the interests of the fans and the owners. And here's something, the governance again, tedious, I know, that we haven't got, that I think now we've got a chance to bring in. We haven't got a CBA.
Collective bargaining agreement.
Sorry, yeah.
Yep.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry. We haven't got a collective bargaining agreement whereby the players get a fixed, for let's say 5 years, they get a fixed percentage of the revenue. Right? That's like the debate going on at Wimbledon at the moment.
So why doesn't that exist right now? Just because it's not in anyone's interest to do that? Sorry for asking you.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's the players' union's never been quite strong enough to force the issue.
Yeah, and they've tried to put it together. I think, one of our prominent props was the face of it, I think, coming out of COVID. But actually, when you speak to him, actually, there wasn't that much sign-up from some of the other players. And I think the RPA is still part funded by actually the clubs themselves.
More by the union than the clubs, but a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's true in every sport around the world. I mean, that's how players' associations, or don't want to call them unions, people feel more comfortable about it. That's how they're funded. That's not because therefore you say, oh, they're in hock to the union. No, they're not. It's just that it's the hard thing is get players to pay a subscription fee. That's your problem.
I think a lot of it comes from how they all treated very differently during COVID. Some clubs looked after their players fantastically, did all sorts. Others just said, your salary's been cut. No consultation, so on and so on. So that does bring a little bit of, I've just got to do what's best for me. Do I want to be the one that's trying to upset the apple cart because of the implications? So, but, it's a boring word, but, governance, structure, those are the key things you need in any business to be successful, especially in such a competitive one. But hopefully, as Mark says, they've got an opportunity and they are taking steps in the right direction.
I don't think it'll be the next thing that happens, by the way. I think there's a whole load of other smaller issues because the CBA is a
big deal.
Big deal.
Yeah.
And it'll take, I worked on one for a while and it takes forever. 85 issues. I think there's other things that can come in quicker and more easily that they all need to be reinforcing each other. There's no magic bullet here. There's a whole load of other things, and that salary colour is one, and that's a tick. A commitment to expansion over time. I agree. I think that's a really good thing. It'll do things like, I think Worcester will come back now. I look around. Where would I put? If I was looking for an expansion team to finance, I'd go to Worcester.
So they do their season of the chap, and then they bid to be part of the Prem.
Look at they've got a property asset. They've got real estate. They've got a fan base. You go in your head. You go through all these things and say, well, where would this work? It's not a question of, and this is the bit I think where you're right. This is a bit alien to English sports fans. My view would be you look for the areas where it's got a genuine chance of working. In other words, what's the pot size of the market? What's the stadium situation? How much in terms of reason? I made a good point about local sponsors, but it does help. And above all, how strong's football? You cannot ignore how strong football is. Yeah. If you go into a market where football, and I know it sounds a bit weird, but in certain parts of this country and Scotland, actually, to be fair, football's so strong, you go, no, not really. No, thanks a lot, but there may be a lot of people there, but no.
So do you think long-term Manchester and Newcastle can turn into
I think Newcastle
success stories?
Easier than Manchester because it's only one football team.
Yeah.
And the thing with Manchester, you've got Rugby League, you've got Wigan and Warrington and St Helens, and I think the Northwest is the most difficult market for Rugby Union of all the regions.
I agree. Just if we take a step back, right? We're at UCFB. Without being too academic about this, what I'm hearing is the nature of applied workings, theory and practice. Mark's already mentioned it: uncertainty of outcome, open closed league systems, jeopardy. All of the ingredients that you need to run a successful, sustainable organisation, whether that's a high street business, whether it's a airline, whether it's a professional sport organisation, you need to create demand. And you can only create demand if you've got a scarcity of products. So the Northwest is hypersaturated. Football, rugby league, netball actually is pretty big in Manchester. if you take lessons from Rugby League, hugely concentrated and powerful M62 corridor from east to west, one of the only types of sport that we have actually that goes horizontally across the country. And when we look at what happened with Rugby League, we've got some key lessons in there. So they opened a franchise in Cardiff, failed. They opened a franchise in London twice, failed. They opened a franchise in the south of France, has been moderately okay. So the expansion policy, the ingredients you need for that are exactly as Mark and Alex have just described. What are they? Where's there a lack of competition, but where there is an opportunity to gather that support? So maybe I'm a little bit boring. I look at motorway corridors, right? There's a heartland, isn't there, for Rugby Union across the M4 from London across to Gloucester. You could probably creep into Wales and go towards Cardiff if you want, because there's a bit of disarray, isn't there, in Welsh rugby. And then you probably pop down the M5 corridor to pick up Exeter. You might even go into Cornwall.
I think there's room for one more in the far southwest.
Yeah, agreed.
I really, whether it's Plymouth or somewhere in Cornwall.
Yeah.
There's definitely enough people.
There's a huge amount of support. There's a lack of professional football.
Yeah.
There's a lack of rugby league. And you have communities that are interested in sport and want to follow organisations. Now, when we look at the US model, it's a hyper-commodified and commercialised system. The big key difference for me, if we put aside open-closed league systems, we put aside salary caps, draft systems, academy structures, all the things that are nuanced in Western Europe and in the States. The one big difference you get in any franchise-based competition is the winner doesn't take it all. And each of the owners understand that. I only exist if I can play against you. You only exist if you can play against him, and you only exist because you can play against him. And collectively, we will organise our competition so we play each other. We'll create a collective bargaining agreement and a distribution system where if you lose a lot of games this year, we'll help you out, we'll prop you up, because you being competitive is really important to our product. And I think that's the unique opportunity that faces professional rugby in England right now, is we've lost some historic clubs. We've decided, or the union has decided, and the Prem has decided to close the system, but has this expansion idea. So now it has a responsibility to ensure that those clubs run sustainably and that they understand that it's important for each of those clubs within the 10 to be competitive, because that will nudge up the value, nudges up the TV, because uncertainty of outcome increases. We don't know who's going to win. I mean, when Northampton won the playoff, we hadn't expected it. So there was, it was hitting our back pages, it was hitting mainstream news because it wasn't an expected outcome necessarily. And I think those are some of the conditions you need to really produce a product that is going to be commercially sustainable.
The report takes it kind of one step further by even talking about drafts for academy players and a centralised academy system for the expansion.
And that's where
would that work?
Well, in theory, but the social capital, the cultural value, the way that we are wedded as a society to even talk about an open and closed league system, Mark referred to it, is almost, that's the dirty word, is when you're not going to have promotion relegation. What do you mean? We have promotion relegation with everything.
If you just look at the reaction that Mrs. Neville and Carragher created with the European Super League, and, we're going to burn down Anfield, the fans won't have it, so on and so on. So most rugby fans are sports fans. So I agree with Mark. It's almost this message almost embedded on you, really imprinted on you that, it's a closed shop is not good. You want to have the dream that your local town can come all the way and be champions of Europe. But in reality, nowadays, that isn't the case. I've done a few, podcasts looking at the Welsh game. And, you can't have a more passionate audience and, a great product on its day. But unfortunately, we've moved on a long way from Ebervale beating the All Blacks or Swansea beating the All Blacks, and comparing their metrics to La Rochelle. It's chalk and cheese, and you can't, you can't do the same thing. So
it's just too small a market.
It is. So, and I know one of the questions I put to you, Mark, if you had a blank bit of paper, would you go so far as to say, actually, why don't we just have rugby as opposed to Rugby League and Rugby Union? Because for me, the games are relatively I'm a fan of both. I like
Yes, I'm
watching both.
and I've worked in both.
Yeah.
And, I was an owner, small percentage at Melbourne Storm, and still am. I think the cultural resistance to that would make
I'll
the
deal with that.
franchise.
You've just got the blank
Well,
bit of
deal
paper.
with the
You've got
franchise.
the blank bit of paper.
Well, look, I still grieve for 1895. Okay, I'm one of the few people in the world, I think, who still looks on it with the sound. When the centennial or the bicentennial comes around, if I won't be alive. But I would grieve because I'm a real nerd on the history of the game, and that was one of the big things. The two things that condemned Rugby Union to a minority position in this country was one, the refusal in the 1880s to have a national cup competition, and the 1895 split.
Yeah.
Those were the two things, and we've neither sport has ever really recovered from it. But I do think it's interesting, and go back to the NRL, to look at what the other rugby code has done in a market not dissimilar in size to England. The Rugby League market in Australia is about 13 million people. It's New South Wales and Queensland, right, basically. And there's bits of other sports, obviously, but it's not far off what the rugby market is in this country. It's about 10 million. And you look at some of the things they've got, and this is why I keep coming back to this point about going for a closed expansion league. What I hope it will do is to basically empower the executive and the league, and that the clubs, a bit like what I was saying, that they step out, and they've struggled with this for 30 years. What matters is what's good for the collective, not what's good for individual one or two clubs. And I would still argue, I'll be very unpopular for this, I'm sure, we've still got a largely shareholder board, which effectively means the clubs and CVC.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, you're conflicted. You just are. When push comes to shove, it's almost impossible to separate what's good for your club that you own, work for, represent, and what's good for the league.
So how do you change that mindset? Is it possible?
You change no, not at all. Well, Australian Rugby League did it in about 2008, where they got so fed up with the clubs almost destroying value in their fierce determination to win over their local rivals. The clubs went to the Australian and said, look, we accept it. We got it horribly wrong. Look, you do it. Elect a commission. They run the game. You do the CBA. You do the broadcast deal. You do, and we'll just. And that, look, that's not to say the clubs still haven't got some power. Of course they do. They've got significant power. But the balance has changed. And it's no coincidence that 20 years on from that fundamental governance change, they've exploded. They've just exploded. They've got other things working in their favour too, of course. But that's quite a big bit of it. And I'm hopeful that now we've crossed the Rubicon of closing the league off, we might start to address some of the other things.
So when we look at rebrands, the second tier of rugby is being rebranded as the Champ. Where does that leave the Champ in terms of closed leagues and expansion leagues?
Mark's just looked across here at me. I'm going to try and have a go
I
at
gave
this.
him a bag of sick, didn't I, which he then handed on.
Because it's contentious, right? Because of all the things we've just talked about around cultural capital and how we want to follow our teams. So without being too controversial / provocative, some of the teams that will operate in the Prem will need to have larger shares of the talent pool market. So I think a lot of the clubs in the Champ will become the training ground for some of those elite players. And I don't think we should shy away from that. We see it in so many other sports where academy structures will produce high quality talent. There's an opportunity to bring those into the first team, and then you can then progress those through. If you look at cricket, when we do the cricket podcast, we'll talk about player performance index and how players are developed in smaller counties and then they'll graduate up and then ultimately play for England. Now, there's a funding mechanism that supports that, by the way. So I think that's ultimately the Champ will become the training ground for the elite talent that will participate in the Prem and will feed England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, national teams if necessary and if able, but that won't detract from the standard of competition in the Champ. It will reduce some of the operating costs actually, because they won't have to build bigger stadia, they won't have to buy land to improve the infrastructure of the stadium and that type of thing. Now, you might rightly say to me, well, that's not very ambitious for clubs in the Champ, but I think we have to be realistic about the value of rugby union and what it can potentially generate as a national
But you're
sport.
right, those fans are the teams knocking on the door, so we've been knocking for ages, so we're going to continue knocking.
Yeah, and they can keep knocking, but unfortunately, we've got to be realistic that, can these clubs compete at the highest level in terms of the funding that is required? And there's going to be a massive revenue gap for them because they're not going to have the same amount of money coming through the door. They're not going to have the infrastructure. And then how does that impact upon the product? And even when you speak to the board at the Championship, one of their concerns is, we can't really get a great sort of commercial rights offering because some of the facilities don't look great on screen. And it's the same with Bernie Ecclestone with Formula One. He massively focused on what does my product look like when it's being beamed around the world. So there aren't that many great stadiums dotted around in the Championship that will look great on your screen. So I think they've got a great role to play. I love playing in the Championship, semi-professionally, travelling around, and the local community can still get behind those clubs. But there's nothing wrong with the owners of those clubs, just accepting what that club is, and it isn't necessarily going to be the next La Rochelle or Bordeaux, because being blunt, comparing Doncaster to Bordeaux, they're very different towns and cities.
And Mark, does it naturally sit at 12 teams ultimately, or even 14?
No, I don't think it naturally sits at 12. No. I think probably 14. No, 16 is quite an interesting number. You can do interesting things.
You made 11 work in Super Rugby.
We did, yeah, not very well, but yeah. But you can, that's the thing. You can make any number work. That's not the point. Again, the NRL's been working with 16 teams, now 17, soon to be 18, 19, 20 for years, but not when this is another shibboleth. Great word.
Good word.
Good word. You have to play everyone home and away. NRL done. NRL done. This idea that because football does it, somehow you have to copy that. You could 16 you could do some interesting stuff. You could play everybody once and certain team and local derbies twice, a bit like the URC do that to a degree. So I don't get hung up on the number of teams. I get hung up on the let's not bring in another team and then wonder how we're going to fund it or how they're going to fund it. That's the key. If there's any lesson to be learned of the last 30 years, is don't expand in hope. That I think has been Rugby League's problem, right? And I've been a big supporter of York Knights expand into York. Why? Well, there's 150,000 people in York. It's got a bit of a Rugby League heritage. Football's not massively strong, with all due respect to that great game they played at the last. They got a wonderful stadium. It's an absolute cracker of a stadium. They got a really good stadium deal. Right? And that gives you an audience. You're never going to get a big enough audience. I'm going to upset my mate Nick Easter now. At a Chinner, right? It's a tiny little. It's barely a town, right? What they've done is absolutely sensational. You're not going to get it out of Anthill. There are a whole load of clubs in the current Champ who just want to have a decent side and play at the highest possible level that they can. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But the idea that somehow somebody comes along and puts in a couple of million and they win it, they should get promoted, is ludicrous. Absolutely ludicrous. That's not viable. That's not what we're after. You look at people are very critical of the first 30 years, but one thing I would point to, and I am to a degree, but you look at the millions that have gone into stadia in rugby union in this country in the last 30 years. We had a situation whereby the only grounds of any size were in the West Country and the Midlands. The North and the South East, where it was not a spectator game, it was a player's game. You'd go to watch Harlequins in the 80s. They were a great side. They had about 600 people watching them. Didn't matter. Didn't matter. Look at the Stoop now. Look at what Saracens have built in Barnet. Look at
Exeter.
Look at Exeter.
Yeah.
You say, oh, they were lucky. They had a sit. Well, okay. Well, luck plays a part too. Yeah, they had a ground in the middle of the city that they were able to solve, but they did really good things with it.
And when they built the new one, they didn't build the whole stadium at the same time, temporary stands. And as they got better and brought more money in, they made...
They built a bit like Stoop did it in 4 phases.
Yeah.
That's just as important as your team. In fact, I would argue probably it's more important. But you've also got to have a market. You've got to have... It's the same as broadcast. You've got to have an audience. If you haven't got a real audience that isn't already captured by another code or another sport or another team... It doesn't matter how well you run it, it's not going to work. And hoping so won't make it so. And I know people think that's lack of ambition. No, it's not. It's just being realistic.
It's experience, though, isn't it?
Just being realistic. Anyone could do those numbers.
The bit I always find quite interesting is the approach you take. And if, we're not talking about Welsh rugby, but you, from afar, you see how they've tried to restructure there, and it's almost okay, well, we're really focused almost on the performance of the Welsh team and those two teams, therefore to make those competitive. And obviously they initially said, well, we think it's 2 teams, but this pushback was so great, let's go for 3. And they've actually now just put their hands up and say, well, look, we'll leave it as it is at the moment. But it's a different way of looking at it, saying, as opposed to not necessarily financial stability, but actually to have a product that the Welsh public want to go and watch and engage with, we have to condense to have 2 strong regional teams and then a strong national team.
I don't want to open a can of worms there. But
Another 3 hours.
I know, anytime anyone mentions Welsh rugby, you almost curl up in a ball.
I do. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. It's just so difficult, and honestly, it's so complicated, and I would take hours and hours and hours. But
we haven't got that.
We haven't got that, so I'm not going to go there.
But what I will do, I'll finish with a quote by James Haskell, who said that franchise rugby or expansion league isn't going to be a silver bullet for Rugby Union. He said
it's not.
It's going to be a system design
It's
change.
a key step.
So my first question was, how do you make Rugby Union sustainable in this country? Is that the answer to making it more sustainable rather than properly sustainable? Because you kind of rallied against it needing to wash its face because it's Rugby Union.
I'm not saying. I suppose what I'm saying is to measure it by a narrow load of metrics is not helpful. But I do agree that the structures and the governance and the lack of alignment we've still got, is a problem. This step mitigates that and offers opportunities to mitigate further. That's what I'm on.
Yeah. And to quote Rory McIlroy, which I would normally.
Oh, no.
I think
Big Ulster fan.
Yeah, he is.
Big Ulster fan.
Investor, isn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. He said, you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your structures. And it comes back to what we've said.
I never heard that one.
Yeah.
Did he say that?
He did, yeah. I'm sure he quoted someone else.
I think Mark Evans is going to say it soon.
Yeah.
I'm on Sunny Nick.
Do you feel I quite liked it? I was writing a business plan in my day job earlier in the week, and I saw that. But it's true. It's what we've said. It's all great having these lofty ambitions, but unless you've got good structures and processes in place, I know it's boring. No one likes it. Everyone just wants to have this passionate leader or passionate benefactor that's going to go and sign Antoine Dupont and Ardy Surveyor, and suddenly, everyone's going to be tuning in on a Thursday night to watch Rugby Union here. That doesn't work, unfortunately. We've tried that.
What do you think, Rob?
I think that's why we called the podcast Sport Structured, isn't it?
Yeah.
The fundamentals are absolutely critical in building sustainable, long-term, viable businesses. And for us as fans, hugely interesting competitive matches of Rugby Union in this sense.
I want to bring it back finally to you. You've done everything when it comes to Rugby Union and a bit in Rugby League as well. What did you enjoy most? Player, coach, CEO, investor?
It's hard to beat playing. It is. Even though I wasn't a particularly good player, I played at a reasonable level. But
I played 100 games to sound.
Yeah, but we weren't nearly as good in those days. But it is hard to beat playing. Honestly, I loved it all. I mean, I'm still as besotted with it as I was when my dad took me to Cardiff at 6 years old, and I watched Gareth Edwards and Barry John and Gerald Davis and thought all club teams were like this. No, I find I'm very passionate about it. I find the game, it drives me mad that it doesn't grow quicker, because I think it's gladiatorial. You got to be brave. It's got collision. I love my collision sports. All right, they're my favourite. I like American football.
Yep.
I like Rugby League. I like Rugby Union. Can't quite get next to ice hockey. But it's got all this great stuff in it. The people are really, on the whole, very, very decent, hard-working people. And it drives me mad that the game is not bigger than it is. Albeit I do recognise I've seen massive growth in my time.
Will you come back for part 2 later on in the year? Because we could do hours.
Be a pleasure.
Thank you for your passion, your insight.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here, Alex, Rob, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And that's it for another episode of the Sports Structured podcast with Leonard Curtis. Hopefully we proved we do things a little bit differently. Yes, there's informed conversation and debate, but it's backed up by cutting-edge research and data, plus recommendations aimed at growing longer-lasting and more sustainable sport for years to come.